This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by BioEquity Europe. BioEquity is Europe's premier international showcase for financial dealmakers and biopharma executives to meet rising biotechs.
I'm Steve Usdin, Washington Editor of BioCentury, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by Jennifer Goldsack, CEO of the Digital Medicine Society. DIME was founded in 2019, and it's quickly become an indispensable player, shaping public policy and providing tools that are advancing digital medicine. I think of it as serving as a bridge between two incredibly dynamic worlds or mindsets, which is especially challenging because both digital technologies and biomedicine are experiencing and causing exponential rates of change. In my conversations with biopharma leaders, they often talk about the promise of digital technologies and also the challenges of integrating them with an industry that operates on different timescales, requires different levels of capital investment, and is subject to different kinds of regulatory oversight. Jennifer, DIME says its mission involves advancing the ethical, effective, equitable, and safe use of digital medicine to redefine healthcare and improve lives. There's a lot embedded in that sentence. I'd like to spend the next half hour or so unpacking it, starting with the last part. How do you envision digital medicine redefining healthcare?
Steve, great question and thrilled to be here today. So if we think about today's healthcare system, it's actually a sick care system. We sit in the clinic waiting for a patient to present sick at our doorstep before we begin to treat them. And our healthcare system is measured by how good we are at treating them once they are already identified as being sick. What we get excited about in the digital era of healthcare is the ability to be able to identify much earlier when a patient or when a person may be at risk, and to create a healthcare system that is focused on keeping them well and outside of the clinic. That's what we mean by redefining healthcare. And I think it's particularly pertinent as we look at some recent drug approvals. We look, for example, at the recent Alzheimer's drug approvals that are contingent on identifying a patient with symptoms as early in the progression of their disease as possible for the optimal treatment effect. This is what we mean by redefining healthcare. Can we start to define healthcare as an industry that's intended to keep people well instead of an industry that's intended to intervene once a patient is already sick?
So the Alzheimer's example is a good one, and more broadly in neurological conditions, degenerative neurological conditions. What I've heard from people in the field is a kind of frustration because they feel that they're being asked to replicate using digital tools the same imperfect and unreliable measures that are used in the clinic. And what's really needed is to move beyond that so that you can, in a sense, redefine the disease. What are your thoughts about that?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think the frustration that you're hearing from industry is exactly what we hear, and it's spot on. I'm of the opinion that if all we do with these new digital tools is replicate exactly what we've always done using different modalities, while there might be incremental benefit of being able to overcome the challenges of place, for example, we leave all of the other benefit on the table, and we're never going to get the ROI either for businesses or for patients that these tools facilitate. I think we absolutely have to be looking at, is there a way that we can redefine some of these incredibly complex diseases that we have not been able to truly wrap our arms around, where we are still struggling with the biological mechanisms, and where in some cases we don't even have drugs that could modify symptoms, and we certainly don't have any cures. This is exactly where these digital tools can do the greatest good. And this is where we're focusing our attention in partnership with industry and in partnership with our regulatory colleagues here at DIME.
And it sounds like also when we're talking about redefining healthcare, we're also talking about, and you hinted at it, moving to what people in the biopharma world called interception. So being able to detect diseases before their clinical symptoms even, and being able to head them off before they become irreversible problems.
And we can look at what our colleagues geneticists have done to be able to do that. We're able to take, someone's sort of genetic predisposition for disease, and we're able to intervene, we're able to care for them, we're able to monitor them in such a way that we reduce the burden of disease for someone who otherwise would have been highly likely to suffer. How can we start to do that with digital phenotypes? And how can we do it in a way that's low cost, low friction, equitable, and available for everyone? That's essentially what we see as one of the biggest promises. It's not just using sensor technologies, for example, as endpoints, but can we start to identify digital phenotypes? Individuals who might be at more risk, who might be progressing more quickly, certain subsets who might be responders to a certain kind of treatment pathway. This is an enormous opportunity, not only for developing new therapies, but also making sure that as these therapies are developed, that we are doing, what we've talked about in terms of precision medicine for a long time now, which is, right patient, right treatment, right time. Can we actually identify those patients who are most likely to respond to a given therapy once it's on the market? I think digital offers the promise to do all of that in a relatively low friction and in a relatively affordable way, Steve.
So we're talking about low friction. The friction point, one of the friction points in anything having to do with developing therapeutic interventions is the regulatory system, and another is reimbursement or the business models that are involved. Let's talk about both of those for a moment. How are the regulators doing in terms of creating kind of a pathway that will allow companies to develop digital medicine in the way that you think it should be?
Steve, for what my opinion's worth, I think our regulatory colleagues are doing an exceptional job. I think sometimes we might hear frustration from industry about where our regulatory colleagues are, but I would venture perhaps two things in response to that. I think, first of all, it's not up to our regulatory colleagues to lead the way. It's up to them to be responsive to where industry wants to push. And I think we have to be harnessing these tools. We have to be thinking about the case examples, and we have to be bringing data to our regulatory colleagues in order to push them in their thinking. Whenever we have seen this happen, we've seen our regulatory colleagues be incredibly responsive. And we've also seen how our regulatory colleagues have engaged with pre-competitive collaborations, such as those we host at DIME, to really advance the methodologies, and in some cases, even demonstration projects to this end. We can get excited about the work that's coming down the pike as a result of the PDUFA 7 mandates, where our CEDA colleagues are going to be funding 3 demonstration projects related to DHTs. Just last week, Steve, we saw the DHT framework get published by FDA. We saw a really terrific public meeting for 2 days last week, hosted by Duke Margolis, again, part of PDUFA 7 obligations. And that's the first in a series of 5 meetings related to DHTs. And that doesn't even contemplate the actual regulatory guidance that's come out. So we can look at the use of digital health technologies for remote data acquisition in clinical trials. That guidance came out in December 2021, draft guidance. I would say that's about 5 or 6 years after there really was a meaningful groundswell of interest in the use of sensor technologies in clinical trials. That 5 to 6 years from initial technical capabilities emerging and industry interest in harnessing those is a remarkable timeline, especially if we reflect on the fact that it took 10 years to bring the PRO guidance to fruition. We are moving more quickly, and we see that sort of embrace and confidence in industry too. So Steve, at DIME, we maintain a crowdsourced library of digital endpoints. This is an open access library for folks who are interested. We launched this library of digital endpoints that are actively being used to answer questions about the safety and efficacy of new medical products in the before times, Steve. So in October 2019, back in October 2019, we were delighted to report that there were 34 digital endpoints that were being used by 12 sponsor companies. And we thought that this was tremendous adoption. Fast forward to where we are today, there's 374 digital endpoints being used by 107 sponsor organizations currently to answer questions about the safety and efficacy of new medical products. So, if we really didn't believe that the regulatory environment was going to be quite accepting of this, if we really didn't believe that the quality of the tools existed, if we really didn't believe that there was value to be derived from the decision to incorporate digital endpoints, we wouldn't see this groundswell of activity. So what we try and do at DIME is encourage the highest value use of these tools, both for businesses, for the clinical questions we are trying to answer. And most importantly, the patients we're all here to serve.
So that's 300 plus digital endpoints that are being used in clinical trials. How many have actually been validated and accepted by regulators for use on labels, for use in actually prescribing therapies for patients?
Steve, this is a challenge. It feels like the gotcha question, although I know it's not intentional. It's the question that everyone asks. And the big answer to that question is absolutely zero. But I would encourage us to remember that the time it takes to bring a new drug to market is 10 years. And we were just talking about the fact that these technologies really only got to a point of maturity about 5 or 6 years ago. So I don't think we should be surprised that we haven't yet seen a label or an approval of a new drug or a biologic, or even the clearance of a device based on a digital endpoint, simply because of the cycle time it actually takes to bring a product to market. Although for what my opinion will be worth, when we sort of talk to industry, when we look at the data we have in the endpoints library, I would be shocked if we didn't have a label this year and potentially even an approval that comes down. I think that we are at this point holding back a pretty big groundswell of activity, and we will start to see those labels, certainly, and maybe even an approval as a result of these digital endpoints. And I'm of the opinion we'll see the first of those this year in 2023.
And what are they going to look like? Because when we started down the path kind of precision medicine, at first there were labels that had specific tests from specific companies, companion diagnostics on them, and then regulators moved to a more kind of agnostic framework where they just said basically you have to have a test that has parameters that it can do certain things, and it's up to you to figure out how to do it, or there are other, multiple tests could be approved for the same drug. When we're looking at these digital endpoints on labels, what do you think those labels are going to look like?
So this is the big question, and one of the questions that we're asked often at DIME is, do we need to qualify this digital endpoint, right? Do we need to get this sort of blanket a priori acceptance of this measure? Is that the right strategy? And look, the right people to talk to about your regulatory strategy are our regulatory colleagues. I don't speak for FDA, but I'm full of opinions, and I'm going to offer mine now, Steve. The vast majority of the endpoints that we rely upon in clinical trials today are not qualified, right? I would struggle to find anyone who's going to argue with cardiac mortality or hospitalization as trustworthy gold standards in heart failure trials, but they're not qualified, right? We've taken our reps, they've become ingrained, we've developed a deep understanding of them, but each time they're accepted as part of an individual IND pathway. That, to my mind, is likely the strategy that I would expect to see leaders in the field pursuing, that they are able to tether a digital endpoint to a particular mechanism of action or a particular claim that they want to make for a new medical product. And they do that work through an IND pathway as opposed to the qualification pathway. But based on the examples I've just given, once you've started to see these things accepted, then you start to see a level of confidence in the rest of the industry to take these things forward. So I don't think that we should be tethered to a particular measure for a particular indication. I don't think that serves us or patients terribly well. But I also don't think that we should be pursuing qualification for every single digital endpoint that we want to use to answer questions about the safety and efficacy of new medical products, because we simply don't do it. For any other endpoint, whether it's a traditional sort of wet lab biomarker, whether it's an imaging biomarker, whether it's a PRO, typically those are developed, used and reused independently, and we should expect exactly the same thing when we are talking about digital tools as opposed to imaging tools, or as opposed to lab-based tools, or as opposed to patient observer or clinician reported tools.
Well, we've spent the time so far talking about the redefining health part of it. I want to get to the safety and the equity and the other issues, the ethics that we talked about at the start in a moment. First, we have to take a quick break.
The 23rd Bioequity Europe Conference heads to Dublin, Ireland in May 2023 with a program focused on how to create a new playbook for biotech success in Europe. In 2022, over 800 industry leaders from 30 countries joined BioEquity in Milan, Italy for 2+ days of strategic panels, one-to-one partnering meetings, and C-level networking. More than 150 biotechs selected by BioCentury presented their story to investors and potential partners. Don't wait, 2 of the last 3 in-person BioEquity conferences sold out. Register today and join BioCentury EBD in our Dublin Regional Host Committee at the industry's premier C-suite and investor conference. Visit bioequityeurope.com for more information.
We're back with Jennifer Goldsack of DIME. Yeah, Jennifer, I want to take a kind of a bigger picture now on some things. You've talked before, and DIME has developed tools that are intended to help companies deal with or satisfy requirements for diversity, equity, inclusion, what's sometimes very glibly called DE&I. I know you've got opinions about that. Can we start maybe first with your thoughts about how people should think about those 3 things, the DE and the I, and what digital tools can do to help patients, to help society, and to help companies that are developing therapies?
Yeah, and I think, first of all, I want to tease out some of the language that you use, Steve, around this idea of requirements. They are emerging, but frankly, I don't think that there are enough. And so what we have to do as an industry is create low friction ways to actually ensure that we are developing new therapies that work for everyone with any given condition. I think the digitization of healthcare and clinical trials gives us a way to do that. But just as you said, first of all, we actually have to distinguish between the different elements of D, E, and I to do this well. So diversity actually being recognizing that the different differences, whether those are clinical differences, whether those are sort of social determinant of health differences that actually render sometimes different risk levels, different levels of disease burden, or different outcomes, we have to recognize them first, and we have to measure them in order to meaningfully address them in the way we develop new medical products. How do we address them? We want to pursue equity. We want to make sure that regardless of what your background might be, or regardless of what, a set of different characteristics might be, that we are offering you the same opportunity of access to a trial and equal opportunity and equitable opportunity to be able to, in the future, receive a medical product that actually works for you. And that requires that we are inclusive. That requires that the clinical trials enterprise is welcoming, culturally appropriate, and thoughtful when it comes to every single member of the population our industry exists to care for. And I think recognizing those 3 different elements actually takes us a very long way to being a more DE&I, we'll use the contraction perhaps obnoxiously, sort of aware and effective industry.
So every conversation, and there are a lot of conversations about DE&I, points to remote trials, decentralized trials, other kinds of digital technologies as ways to enhance what companies are doing, and kind of as solutions. And I know DIME has got kind of a toolkit, right, of those things. So can you talk a little bit about that? One, how big a difference can digital technologies make? They're not going to cure inequities in society with an app. And second, what's in your toolkit that you're offering to companies?
Yeah, of course. And I think, Steve, it's actually, it's good to hear that your sort of experience with leaders in our industry is that they are quite bullish about, an expectation that technologies will come in and support us as we try and create a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive clinical trials enterprise. Unfortunately, I continue to get frustrated by the same question being asked again and again, like, oh gosh, if I use a decentralized approach, and in particular, if I decide to deploy technologies in my clinical trial, doesn't this make our approach even more inequitable along the digital divide? And I get frustrated because I think while the question comes from a good place, I think it's the wrong question. We only need to look at the limited statistics we actually have about the representation in our clinical trials. And I say limited information because all too often we neither collect nor report that sort of information. to recognize that we're in a very bad place right now. Very little about how we develop new medical products provides good access for every member of the population that we're here to serve, to actually be able to participate in a clinical trial in a way that's feasible for them and their day-to-day life. Nor do we know very much about how new medical products work in the vast majority of the population, where we try and then prescribe them and use them in order to care for people in the post-market. So I think we have to be quite real with ourselves about the current state. And then once we sort of acknowledge that, it's less about are digital tools a silver bullet, or are these things coming in to make an already very challenging and inequitable situation and industry worse. I think it's much more about how do we harness this watershed moment, this moment of transformation driven by the digitization of clinical trials, and how do we actively make sure that we bring everyone with us for the first time in our industry as we do this. And so, Steve, you alluded to the toolkits and the resources that we've developed in partnership with industry and regulatory colleagues here at DIME. We have a variety of different tools, both around our, rendered from our DE&I and digitized clinical trials projects, and also Data CC, which is our collaborative community that we're delighted to co-host in partnership with our FDA colleagues, where we think about what does it mean to be inclusive as we develop the kinds of digital technologies that we want to use in clinical research and healthcare, recognizing that the problems that we want to solve for and the way we actually develop the product in the first place makes a big difference. Then we recognize that even if you have the perfect tool, should such a thing exist, and we can talk about that, there's no guarantee that we roll it out. We develop protocols, for example, in such a way that they work for everyone, even if the tool is good quality. So then how do we think about deploying these tools in a way that they meet our ambitious goals for a more diverse, a more equitable, and a more inclusive clinical trials environment? We have a variety of different tools and toolkits on each of those, and then not just limited to the use of the sorts of digital health technologies, those sensor-based technologies we've been talking about. We think about how can we design and deploy these products, whether these products are related to real-world data and evidence, whether they are related to artificial intelligence and machine learning, whether it's the use of video visits or other kinds of asynchronized sort of nudges and communications, whether it's the use of different kinds of non-clinical measures like adherence tools, for example. We consider and contemplate all of the digital tools in the toolbox, their development and their deployment, because we have to think along those lines, Steve, in order to be effective. And we also think about all of the different vectors of inclusion. We know the typical sort of elements of diversity in a clinical trial. Those almost form a matrix with different elements of the digital divide and new challenges and opportunities that the use of digital tools provide. And while that sounds like an awful lot, the power in these toolkits is they reduce it down to very simple, off-the-shelf sort of one pages, or here are the top 3 things you must do, or here's your checklist, so that folks who are actually investing in the digitization of clinical trials can also be rewarded through the benefits of more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive clinical trials, ideally ones where it's easier to recruit, and ideally ones where we can make better clinical decisions about what these new medical products do and for whom.
So one of the things that I think is closely intertwined with all of this is something else, getting back to your mission statement at the beginning of our conversation, which is the idea of safety. So in the biopharma world, safety means something very specific. Usually it means something like adverse effects, or whether a drug is effective or not, or something like that. When we're talking about digital tools, safety is a whole different suite of concerns, isn't it? What are the concerns? What do you mean by safety, and what are the things that need to happen to keep people safe?
It's a really good question. And so we think about what's the risk of harm, right? That's our definition of safety, and how can we prevent those harms, right? As in sort of maintaining patient and participant safety. So in the digital era, there are new kinds of risks of harm, right? Whether it's related to equity, which we've already discussed, or whether it's, for example, the risk of harm that might cascade from misuse of your data, for example. So, no one ever expects to come in, and I'm taking an example from my colleague, Eric Baraxlis, who has a few great examples on this, but one of my favorite is, no one expects to go in for a knee replacement and have as a potential side effect their identity being stolen and their credit score being eviscerated. But we know that, in the digital era, your billing records or your medical records may fall into the wrong hands due to a security breach or due to poor privacy practices and behaviors. We can also think about perhaps some of the algorithms that some folks have chosen to rely upon for medical decision making that we know don't perform equally well in different populations, that there may be risk of harm. For example, we've recently seen algorithms that are intended to identify patients who are at risk of stroke. But when we actually analyze the performance of those algorithms, while they work very well in a sort of white Caucasian population, they perform horrendously in every other population. So we are actually risking harm and potentially causing catastrophic health events to folks that we could have prevented if the digital tools that we had chosen to use actually performed well across every member of society. And so we take this really seriously at DIME, whether it's thinking about how do we support folks to implement appropriate security practices, how do we make sure that the privacy practices to make sure that we aren't misusing data are actually not written simply in an informed consent, but are reflected in the terms of service and the privacy policies of the digital tools that we decide to use, and that every single person who touches the data or the data infrastructure is also well trained. So there are no risks, no vulnerabilities, no risks of harm, because it's a safety issue. So as much as the work we do that goes into very applicable solutions to these challenges. Steve, I'm delighted you asked the question, because I think we have to re-educate our field a little bit, that the definition of a safety issue is broader now in the digital era. And just like other risks, we simply have to make sure that we are getting ahead of them and we are implementing sort of risk mitigation strategies to the best of our abilities.
So you mentioned there a couple of times training and education. That's something else I wanted to ask you about, because one of the things also when I speak with biopharma senior management is they wonder, well, where are we going to find these people who are digitally literate, which means people under 30 for the most part. But it's also on the other side, I think, for the people who are in the digital world, how do you get them educated into the very different realities of medical product development? So what are you thinking about that? How are we going to create this workforce that melds these two cultures?
I mean, Steve, you've teed that up beautifully. So I think there's two things. I think, first of all, it's recognizing that the workforce in both of these industries has to change. And we can't have a silo of technical experts and expect them to deliver the optimized solutions in a highly regulated patient care environment, nor can we think about the traditional clinical and research enterprises being wholly responsible for the digitization of their field. We have to think about activity occurring at the intersection of the tech community and the clinical community, and figuring out when we collaborate, when we partner, or when we strategically hire into our appropriate businesses. I think the other piece is we have to recognize, particularly within the clinical environment, that the digitization of healthcare and clinical trials, it's not, is it coming? It is coming. And to some extent, it's already here in a reasonably nascent form. And we simply need to prepare our workforce and position them for success. So we think an awful lot about what's the education requirements for the existing workforce. And Steve, we have some fantastic courses that were a priority for us to offer up at DIME. It's not enough for us to say, look, here's the evidence we've generated around what good looks like. We have to support the field. So we have courses, for example, a digital fundamentals for pharma course, where we have top 10 pharma who have bought enterprise licenses to really support change management, but also the success of their workforce, the success of their digital strategies, their success recruiting the greatest digital talent by saying we're actually preparing the entire organization. So we have those courses. We also have a direct-to-learner applied digital health ethics course that we hope everyone who's involved in our industry will take, to make sure, back to our conversation about safety, that as we digitize healthcare, as we digitize clinical trials, that we are making sure that these tools help and don't harm. We also have, launching in June, a regulatory 101 class for folks who are uncertain of the regulatory environment and want to use sort of regulatory strategy as a differentiator in a competitive marketplace. So to us, it's not enough to collaborate, although we must do that. We have to upskill the existing workforce to be prepared for success in the digital era of healthcare.
So we're running close to the end of our time, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the one thing that is on everybody's mind when it comes to digital anything, which is generative AI, ChatGPT, and similar products. How do you think about them? Forces for good, forces for bad, and how should people in the biopharma world think about managing the challenges?
Yeah, I love the question, force for good or force for evil. And I think, much as we might want to think these technologies are inanimate objects, especially as they are starting to get quite clever and respond to us quite conversationally, it's up to us and how we build them and how we use them. And I think certainly a strength of these tools right now, Steve, is we only have to look at the utilization of these things. How many times have we heard participants being blamed for non-adherence or site staff not doing what we're asking them to do? What we actually see is, an entire population of people flocking towards these tools. There's obviously power in that. There's obviously appetite and demand for this kind of, generative AI and how it can be worked into a variety of different solutions, from sort of medical records to, patient education and support, clinical decision support. It is actually up to us as an industry at this juncture to make sure that we develop them in a way that is safe, based on all the parameters of safety that we've just been discussing, and equitable, and they actually work. Because I think there's also a lot of buzz around these things. We have to make sure that we are using them to solve pressing challenges in the field, and we aren't simply enamored by the technology, but we can't argue with the appetite that people have to use them. So I think it's up to us to harness that interest and that enthusiasm and make sure that we use it to improve the way that we develop new medical products and to improve the way that we care for people.
So how do you do that, and how do you address concerns like misinformation? I mean, I think that if you look at what's going to happen with ChatGPT and similar products like that, yeah, they have all that tremendous potential that you just described, you just touched on, but they also have a really kind of dystopian potential also.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're probably going to have an independent third party come in and start to look at, maybe it's spot checking, maybe it's certifying the sort of the quality of these tools. You're exactly right. Unfortunately, we do live in an era of mis and disinformation, and that's not to say it's new, right? We can look throughout history back to, people with scrolls and town criers, peddling mis and disinformation, but the way in which this mis and disinformation can be spread in the digital era, it can spread like wildfire. And I think what we have to realize is that all of these generative AI tools are being trained on the data, the language, the information that they're able to scrape. And unfortunately, we know that a lot of that information and that data is incorrect due to almost a sort of pandemic, if you like, of mis and disinformation. So we have to figure out a way of evaluating the performance of these new tools. And I think it probably will come down to, if not regulation, then some independent third party that actually does the work of certifying these new tools and products in order to keep people safe, and in order to make sure that when we do decide to use these tools, we are able to derive value from them and we aren't taking on new and additional risks.
Well, great. Thanks. We've just kind of scratched the surface of things I wanted to talk to you about. I hope we get a chance to do it again. And thank you all for watching.
Thanks, Steve. It was a great conversation. I look forward to the next.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by BioEquity Europe. BioEquity is Europe's premier international showcase for financial dealmakers and biopharma executives to meet rising biotechs.